As I opened the bound roll and read the first name into the cold air of the chapel, I saw the young guardsman at the door raise his right hand into a salute, and I knew, even before he had finished drawing the line of it, that he did not intend to lower it again. My name is Ansel Brockwell. For 19 winters I have been the chaplain of the Bramwell Chapel of Remembrance, the small stone sanctuary where the Bramwell pioneers, 311 years of them, keep their dead. I read this roll every year on the anniversary of the regiment's founding, 4,692 names when I opened the book that morning. I had timed it once, 4 hours and 17 minutes if I did not pause. 4 hours and 40 if the weight of any one name made me stop. The first name was always the same. The founding sergeant of the pioneers, fallen in the year the regiment was raised, a man whose grave lay under the chapel's western buttress. It came out of me steady. I let the sound of it settle in the rafters, and then I lifted my eyes from the book to find the chapel as it should be, the front pews filled with the regiment's officers in their dress coats, the families behind them, the camera crew of the regimental live stream at the very back, their light low. And at the great oak door, 2 royal guards on the partner watch in their red wool tunics and tall black bearskins, white gloves at their sides, rifles shouldered, eyes forward. The younger of the 2 was perhaps 23, a tall, clean-cheeked lad with a steady jaw, the kind of guardsman trained out of every nervous habit a man might carry. The senior watch beside him was a corporal I knew by face. Standard rotation in this chapel is 20 minutes. A man stands his watch and is relieved, and the post is never empty. I had heard the orders given in the antechamber. I had no reason to expect anything but the orders to be followed. And then, as my voice gave the first name of the dead, the young guard's hand came up. It was a salute given properly, the elbow at the correct angle, the gloved fingers held flat, the line of the wrist clean. He gave it to the name, to the man dead 311 years. The corporal beside him did not move. The senior watch is not relieved for every name. I read the second, the third. The salute did not come down. I have led ceremonies of every shape and weight in this chapel. I have buried pioneers. I have stood with their widows. I have come to know what a guard's salute looks like when it is meant for one man and what it looks like when it is meant for an idea. The hand that had risen at the door was meant for both, and for everything in between. I read the fourth name, and I understood, with the cold certainty of a man who has spent his life learning the small signs of devotion, that the young guardsman at the door intended to hold the salute through every name in the book. I am not ashamed to say that for a single breath my voice faltered. The corporal beside the young guard turned his head no more than an inch and looked at his partner. I saw the question pass between them. I saw the corporal's small half-step toward his comrade, the beginning of the relief, the proper movement that would set the rotation in motion and bring the young man's arm down to his side. And then I saw the young guard's left hand, the one not raised in salute, lift just a little from his side, palm out. Stay. The corporal stayed. I read the fifth name and the sixth and the seventh. In the front pew the regiment's senior officer, a colonel whose face I have seen weather 30 winters, lifted his eyes from his order of service. I watched him look at the door. I watched him watch the held salute. I watched him do nothing. He let his eyes settle on the book in my hands and bowed his head again. It is difficult even now to describe what the chapel sounded like in those first 20 minutes. The walls are stone 3 feet thick, and the floor is granite worn smooth by 300 years of boots. There are no microphones in the Bramwell Chapel. There never have been. The livestream camera at the rear takes only what it can hear of the air itself. By the 40th name, I knew the camera had begun to widen its frame. A regimental livestream is not, as a rule, a thing the world watches. We carry the reading because the families of the pioneers are scattered now, and a daughter in some far city ought to be able to hear her father's name read aloud. The audience that morning, I would learn later, was 84. It would not stay 84 for long. I read on. The names came in the order they had fallen: the first century of the pioneers and their long campaigns in places I will not name, the second century and its mountain passes, the third century and its long peace broken by one bitter winter. I read officers and corporals and private soldiers. I read fathers and sons who had fallen a generation apart, with a generation of pioneers between them. I read brothers. I read the name of a man whose great-grandson had been a chaplain in this chapel before me. I read 2 cousins killed on the same day in the same valley 300 years gone. The young guard's arm did not move. At the end of the first hour, I closed the book on my thumb and looked up. The chapel was perfectly still. The colonel in the front pew had not moved. The families behind him had not moved. The camera at the back had widened and widened again, and now it held the whole length of the nave in its frame, the lectern at the front, the pews, the door, and the young guardsman at the door with his right hand raised in a salute that had now lasted 61 minutes by my own count. His face was the face he had brought to the post. Eyes forward, jaw set. The white glove of his salute was perfectly still in the grey winter light that came through the high window above him. I opened the book. The second hour is the hardest of any reading. The voice begins to tire, and the names of the second century are heavy. There are years in there when the regiment lost more than it found, and I have always had to read those years slowly. I read them slowly that morning, and the young guard's arm did not waver, and the chapel did not move. Somewhere in the middle of the second hour I became aware of the corporal beside the door. He had not stepped away. He had not been relieved either. I learned later that the senior watch officer, a captain who was at the rear of the chapel that morning and could have ordered the rotation at any moment, had quietly told the relief party to stand down at the gate. The corporal stood his post. His face, when I caught it between names, was not the face of a man enduring a strange thing. It was the face of a man keeping watch over something sacred. He had set his shoulder a half-inch closer to his comrade than the regulation required, as if to bear, with his own discipline, a portion of what his comrade was carrying. I read the name of a pioneer dead in the year of the second great famine. I read the name of his brother dead the next year of the same hunger. I read the names of the 3 orphans of the regiment who took their father's commission in the year after and died, all 3 of them, in the same campaign. The young guard's white glove did not tremble. At the end of the second hour, I closed the book and drank a swallow of water from the cup the sacristan had left by the credence. I did not look at the door. I did not want, in that moment, to read in the young man's face anything I had no business reading. The salute was his to hold or to lower, and the only decent thing I could do was give him the dignity of believing he would hold it until the book was closed. I opened the book again. I learned afterward that by the second hour, the live stream had passed 10,000 viewers. By the middle of the third hour, 200,000. By the last name, more than 5 million, with mirror feeds carried by every major broadcaster in the country. None of that was in the chapel with me. The chapel had only the names and the breath of the people who heard them. The third hour brought us into the second century's hardest passage, and then into the long, quiet century after, the century in which the regiment held its post and kept its garrisons and lost its men in small numbers year by year to the slow attrition of duty. I read the names of men dead at sea, men dead on long marches, men dead in their tents of fevers I would not name aloud. I read the name of a chaplain of this chapel, killed 2 centuries before me, and I felt the weight of every Sunday he had stood where I was standing. At the beginning of the third hour, the young guard's arm began to tremble. I saw it because I was looking. The colonel saw it too. I caught his eye lift from the floor as I turned a page. The trembling was small. It was the trembling of a muscle that had been held in a single attitude for nearly 2 hours and did not yet know it was going to be held for 2 more. The young guard did not lower the hand. The trembling steadied after a minute. It returned and steadied again. The whole chapel was watching it without watching it, in the way that men of discipline watch a thing they love that is suffering. The senior watch captain came forward quietly from the rear of the chapel. He came up the side aisle between the families and the wall, the way a man walks in a place he does not wish to disturb. He stopped 2 paces from the door. I watched him from the lectern in the pauses between names, and I saw him stand and look at his young guardsman, and I saw what crossed his face. He had the right by every regulation of the regiment to order the man to lower his arm. He had the duty by the same regulations to relieve a watch that was past its rotation. He stood for a long minute beside the young guard. He did not give the order. He stepped back. He took up his own attention at parade rest, 2 paces from the door, and he stood with his guardsman through the rest of the reading. I read the names of the 3rd century. I came to the campaign of the long winter. I had been a young chaplain when those men were buried. I read each name a little more slowly than the last, and the chapel held, and the young guard's arm held, and the camera at the back of the chapel held its frame on the door. I learned afterward what the country was doing while I read. In a cafe in the capital, the patrons asked the owner to turn the television to the regimental feed, and the owner turned it, and no one ordered and no one spoke. In a hospital ward, a nurse turned the channel on the wall set, and the men in the beds asked her to leave it. In the houses of the families of the pioneers, daughters and sons and grandchildren of the dead, I was reading sat with their hands in their laps. and watched a young man at a door in a small stone chapel hold a salute for the men whose names they had heard, all their lives, only in private. None of this I knew. I was reading. In the last half hour the names became, by the strange arithmetic of the rolls, names I had buried with my own hands. I read the name of a sergeant killed in a road accident 11 years ago, whose widow sat in the third pew. She did not weep, she straightened her back. I read the name of a young lieutenant fallen in the regiment's last full deployment, whose father, a brigadier retired, sat in the second pew and brought his right hand slowly to a salute of his own. The colonel in the front pew rose from his seat. He did not turn. He stood facing the lectern, hand at the salute. Behind him the other officers of the pioneers rose, one by one, with the small sound of dress coats and chairs, and lifted their hands. By the time I had read 3 more names, every officer of the regiment in the chapel that morning was on his feet, and every one of them was holding a salute. The young guard's arm had not moved. I read the names of the last 5 pioneers fallen in the regiment's most recent service. I read the name of a captain dead in a training accident 2 years ago, whose wife sat very straight in the 4th pew with both of her sons beside her. I read the name of a pioneer dead the spring before last in a quiet duty I will not describe. I read the names of 2 corporals lost in the same incident, 11 months apart, whose families sat together on the same bench. And then I read the last name on the roll. He was 19 years old. He had fallen the previous winter in the regiment's last loss, on a duty of which the records say only the date and the place. The page of the bound roll has his name written in the regimental clerk's careful hand, with the date below it, and a small mark to show that the ink was new. I had written him into the roll myself in the spring, when his service was certified. I read his name slowly. I read it as if I were giving him to the chapel. When his name was in the air I let it stand for 1 breath, and then for another, and then for a third. The chapel was so quiet I could hear the snow falling against the leaded window above the door. The young guard's hand had not moved. The colonel was still on his feet. Every officer in the chapel was on his feet. The families were on their feet now too. I had not seen them rise. I do not know when they rose. I think it had happened name by name in the last 5 minutes, the way a tide comes in on a flat shore, so quietly that no one sees the line of it move. I closed the book. The sound of the cover meeting the cover was very small. The young guard's right hand came down. He brought it down in the proper line, the way the salute is finished, fingers flat, elbow controlled, the hand settled to his side. He blinked once. He took a breath. The trembling that had been in his arm for the last 2 hours had not gone away, and I saw it in the set of his shoulder when he let the arm down. He did not let it show in his face. The corporal beside him did not move. The senior watch captain, 2 paces from the door, gave a small nod that no one outside the regiment would have read as anything at all, and then turned his head forward again. I stepped down from the lectern. I remember the boots of the colonel on the granite floor as he came forward and took the book from me with both hands and held it against his chest. I remember the families turning slowly to leave by the great oak door. I remember each one of them, as they passed the young guard, finding some small way to honor him without speaking, a hand laid briefly on the lintel, a bow of the head, an old soldier's mother who paused and met his eye and then went on. The young guard did not look at any of them. He did not look at me when I passed him. He had returned, at the moment the salute came down, to the attitude of a man on the post he had been ordered to keep. The next rotation came up at the half hour, and the relief took place as it always does, and the young guard walked out of the chapel and around to the antechamber, and stood, as I learned later, in the small stone alcove behind the sacristy for perhaps 4 minutes, alone, before reporting to his captain for the remainder of his watch. He stood the rest of his watch. By that evening the country was speaking of nothing else. The regiment received, in the week that followed, more letters than in the previous year, and answered them all. The young guardsman gave no interview and accepted no decoration, and asked, through his captain, that his name not be released. The regiment honored the request. He stood his watches as he had always stood them, and the men who saw him at the gate said he was the same man he had been the morning before, only a little quieter, in the way that men who have set a thing down become quieter once it is set down. I went back into the chapel after they had gone, and I stood for a long time at the lectern with the bound roll closed in front of me. The snow was still falling. The light through the leaded glass had moved across the granite floor and reached the place where the young guard had stood. I do not pray often for the living. That afternoon I prayed for him by no name that I knew, and I asked that whatever weight he had taken on himself that morning be carried ever after by all of us who had heard the names. I have read the roll every year since. I will read it again next winter. The young guardsman, by his request, is not part of any record of the chapel except the part that lives in the breath of those of us who were there. But I will tell you this. When the next reading comes, and I open the book and lift my voice to the first name, I will not be the only one in the chapel listening for an answering hand. The names asked it of him, he gave it, and the silence in which he gave it has become, in the chapel and in the country, its own quiet sacrament, the sound of a man who would not lower his hand until the last of the dead had been spoken.